Hello, everyone. This is Gabriel, and welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. In this episode, I speak with none other than Professor Fred Donner of the University of Chicago. We do a little bit of intellectual biography, looking at the history of his work, and especially what led to the project that culminated in his book, Muhammad and the Believers, which has caused lots of interest, or attracted lots of interest and caused a little bit of controversy. So we speak about both the interest in the book, the logic or the basic premises behind the book, but also some of the criticism, and he responds to it. Listen to the end, because we get to a small conversation towards the end of the episode about Professor Patricia Crone and some of his back and forth with her, but also I think really a moving comment that he makes towards the end of the episode. So hopefully you listen to the end. I'm so glad that you're here. While you're here, please take a moment to subscribe to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. That really gives me a lot of encouragement to continue to produce this content, and also like the video while you're here. Thank you so much. Hello, Professor Fred Donner. It's really great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure to join you. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you.
Yeah, this is very exciting. I know it's going to get a lot of interest from a lot of people. I've been doing these conversations with scholars either in Quranic studies or biblical studies for about a year now, and there's been a lot of interest in having me host a conversation with you. So this is the moment. The moment has arrived, and I'm really glad to get a chance. Yeah, alhamdulillah. We'll be Exactly. I'd like to speak, at least for this conversation, principally about your book, which will be, well known to many people, Muhammad and the Believers, and maybe, what led to the project for the book. So a little bit of the backstory, but also, ask for your defense of some of the ideas that have come under criticism. But first, if it's okay, I'll just run through a brief biography, which is not easy because your accomplishments are many. But here we go. So everyone. Professor Fred M. Donner attended Princeton University, graduated with his BA in 1968 and his Ph.D. in Near Eastern Studies in 1975. He taught Islamic and modern Middle Eastern history at Yale between 1975 and 1982. And since 1982, since then, he has been at the University of Chicago, both in NELC and the Oriental Institute, where he teaches courses in early and medieval Islamic history, Islamic law, Arabic paleography, and epigraphy. Professor Donner works on Islamic historiography and Qur'anic studies, Arabic papyrology, and the origins of Islam. His major publications include, but are not limited to, the Early Islamic Conquests, a really foundational work which in some ways has set the standard narrative for thinking critically about the Islamic conquest. That book was published by Princeton in 1981. He also published Narratives of Islamic Origins, the beginnings of Islamic historical writing in 1997. And then this book, Muhammad and the Believers at the Origins of Islam, with Harvard University Press in 2010. Some more recent projects, as he's continued to be very active, a volume jointly edited with Antoine Beirut entitled Christians and Others in the Umayyad State. Did I get that title right, Fred?
Yes.
And that's 2016, I think. And he has also co-edited, I think, at least my notes say, with Rebecca Hasselbach Ande. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
That's right.
Close enough. Okay. A volume entitled Scripts and Scriptures, Writing and Religion in Arabia between 500 and 700 CE. Professor Donner was president of Middle East Medievalists, president of the Middle East Studies Association, or MESA, in 2012. And he serves on the board of an organization dear to me, the International Quranic Studies Association. In 2012, he was inducted as a life member of the Scientific Committee of the Tunisian Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, otherwise known as Beit el-Hikma. And in fact, IQSA held a conference, that is the International Quranic Studies Association, at Beit el-Hikma in 20-something, I don't know, about 6 or 7 years ago. And the acts of that conference, has been edited by Mehdi Zayez and is forthcoming with IQSA Press. Okay, so did I do okay with that bio? Would you add anything or take away anything?
I recognize it. Yeah, I mean, you might add that I'm currently the president of IQSA. Even though I'm not primarily a scholar of the Quran, nonetheless, the membership very kindly decided to make me the president. So in a couple of weeks, I have to give the presidential address at their conference in Palermo, which I'm looking forward to.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll be there together. So we're recording this just a few weeks before the annual meeting of IQSA in Palermo, as you mentioned. I'm not sure when this will be released. It might have taken place already by the time this is released. Yeah, but here's a good moment to say, everyone, join IQSA. It's a great organization of friends and scholars. Okay, so yeah, I just thought we'd start. I don't always do this, but because there's so much interest in your work, in your contributions through your career, could we just start with a little bit of how you got into Islamic studies? Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, it was a long and somewhat accidental route, actually. I went to college thinking I was going to do chemistry, to major in chemistry, which I had enjoyed the sciences and chemistry in high school. But when I got to college, I didn't enjoy the labs as much, and I found I couldn't get the right answer to the problems in theoretical chemistry. The math, differential equations, and so on was just sort of beyond me. And I, as a sophomore in college, I thought to myself, what do I want to do with my life when I grow up? Do I want to work in a chem lab somewhere? And I thought, no, I want to travel and I want to learn a foreign language really well, because I had enjoyed in high school, I'd enjoyed Latin and French a lot. And at the same time, when I was first couple of years at Princeton, I had to take various courses that weren't in the sciences to satisfy distribution requirements. A very wise structure, I think, to make students take a variety of different things in college. And I took first a course on ancient art, thinking, well, I'll learn about Greek and Roman art. That'd be kind of nice. Well, it started with cave painting, and then it went to ancient Egyptian art, and then it went to ancient Mesopotamian art, and worked its way through all kinds of ancient art. We did get to Greek and Roman art at the end of the semester, but there was a lot of other stuff that I had never thought about that I was exposed to. And I got interested in the early sort of archaeology of ancient Mesopotamia and doing sort of outside reading about Mesopotamian art, Akkadian art, and so on, Sumerian art. And I thought, wow, that's really cool, digging up ziggurats in Iraq. And so it struck my fancy. I followed that with a course on medieval art, which was taught by, although I'd never heard of him at the time, it was taught by a man named Kurt Weitzman, who's probably the greatest historian of Byzantine art of the 20th century. And so the first half of the course on medieval art, which I thought was going to be about the stained glass windows of Chartres and things like, it was the first half, it was about Byzantine art, which I'd never heard of. But I just loved it. I loved the color of it. And I just thought the art was wonderful. And his lectures were magnificent on this topic. So that pulled me also sort of in the direction of the Near East. So at the end of my sophomore year, I decided, okay, I'll go into Near Eastern studies with a view to doing probably ancient Near Eastern studies. In the course of my studies, I ended up studying Arabic and shifted over gradually. It took a while to decide between the ancient and the medieval, but I shifted over to medieval Islamic history of the Near East and the Islamic period because it seemed somehow to me more accessible. And I had some good teachers as an undergraduate, especially Avram Mutovich, who had just arrived, who gave a very interesting seminar on law and one on social history. And so these were, topics that I got quite interested in. So that's sort of how I got into Islamic studies. It wasn't a kind of obvious trajectory.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, that's it's amazing how people have different paths that lead them to the field that they eventually pursue. I wonder if you could share, was there a book? I mean, was there like an aha moment from a book you read, a passage from a book, or a lecture from a particular scholar that made you think that not only will I be interested in Near Eastern things generally, or maybe ancient Near East, but specifically in Islam and Islamic historiography?
Well, I can't, certainly for Islamic historiography, I don't think there's any book that made me say, oh, I really want to do this, because it's, as any of you who have worked on it will know, it's a very detail-oriented kind of feel, a sort of mind-numbing detail of tradition chains and so on, and that's not very appealing when you try to read it. The questions are important, though, that it raises. For me, I think thinking about my own formation, as the French would call it, the formation of the scholar, I think the fact that I had a lot of training in sciences has made me a better historian. It made me approach history in a kind of methodical way and rational analysis and so on. I think that was important. The science was not irrelevant to my training as a historian. And I can remember, though, reading in college, once in a while I would read a book that struck me as impressive. It wasn't necessarily an Islamic history. I remember one, for example, now I'm going to have a hard time remembering the name of it. I had it and it went.
No worries. It'll probably come back.
It'll come back, yeah. Lynn White, who taught, I think, at UCLA, wrote a book called Medieval Technology and Social Change, which was a short little paperback book. When I read it, probably, in my sophomore year in college or something, one summer, I got it and I read it. But it was very interesting because it was the first book that I could remember reading where it did what every book of history should do. It has a clear argument, and it works the argument through the evidence and uses the evidence to demonstrate the validity of the argument. And it was, in that book, it had to do with the arrival of the stirrup and the invention of the stirrup, riding horses with a stirrup. And before that, you really can't fight well from a horse because you fall off. But when you have stirrups, you're on this gigantic animal, and you're just a tremendous fighting machine, much better than infantry would be. So the arrival or the invention of the stirrup transformed European society, and he traces it into the arrival, the appearance of knights and knighthood. And it was really a fascinating book. It wasn't that long, but what was great about it for me was the fact that he had a really original idea, and he worked it through the evidence and sort of demonstrated the validity of it using lots of evidence. And that sort of became a model for me for the writing of history and what I look for in good history. Sometimes it can be a very long book that does that. I just read a wonderful book by David Hackett Fisher called Albion's Seed, which is about the settlement by Britons, people coming from Great Britain, from England really, in mainly the 17th century settlement. But it's a wonderful book. It has a great argument, and it's very important for American history, and you learn a ton from reading it, and it's fun to read it. So it's another example of this kind of history writing, which has always been something, it inspired me, and I have aspired to imitate that model.
Right. Yeah, something about the ability to execute a careful argument, but in a way that is fun to read, interesting to read. That seems to mark your work. And yeah.
The aesthetic side of writing history, I think, is also important in terms of using words well and, clarity, but also a kind of artful construction of it so that it's presented in balanced pieces. You don't have a 7-page chapter followed by a 94-page chapter. You want pieces that kind of progress in a kind of even way, so the reader kind of gets drawn into the rhythm of it. So all of that is, I think, important in the doing of history and the writing of history.
So speaking of good historical writing, in thinking now of classical Islamic sources, especially as you were working on the Early Islamic Conquests book, but maybe since then, is there one you have a fave among the early Muslim historians? Maybe in terms of style or content.
One I have not worked on much in recent years, but I took a shine to early in my career, like when I was in grad school and my first few years of teaching, was the history of Mosul by Al-Azdi, Tarikh al-Mosul. Why, I don't know. I mean, it's not that different from many other compilations of that kind, with one exception, which I'll come to in a second. But it's one substantial volume. It's nicely edited from the single manuscript that exists, which I think was in the Chester Beatty Library. So it's pretty well edited, but it was very. I got interested in the history of the city of Mosul at one point in the early Islamic period, and it was a great source for that. It had all kinds of local traditions. It was very interesting, but it's not really different from, say, Tabari's Chronicle or Yaqubi. They all built along the same general lines. The thing that was really great about Azdi's history was, I thought when I read it, there were moments when I felt like, oh, this man really is a historian. And one of the reasons I thought that was because there were moments where he was talking about one of the governors of Mosul in the early Abbasid period, I think. And he said, this man, Wa'al ibn Shahaj, whatever his name was governor from the year something to the year something. He had like a 3-year governorship. And he says, and then he says, while they were doing some excavations to clear out an irrigation system, they came across an inscribed stone. So I got down in the trench and I copied the inscription. And he gives you the inscription, and it's an inscription from this governor with the date. So I thought, wow, this guy, he's using a document. I thought, this is impressive. Because most, people like Tabari and many others, I don't think they use, well, we don't know, but they don't provide a lot of evidence that they used actual documents. But, this man, he saw a document. He says, oh, this is historical evidence. I got to use it.
Got his hands dirty, probably, literally.
It was great that he had that in there. So anyway, that was one example, I guess.
Okay, so a lot of viewers of Exploring the Quran and the Bible will know of your work in historiography, and especially on the conquest, but generally, and numerous studies. And then in 2010, we get this book, which I've shown once, but I'll show again here, Muhammad and the Believers. It seems like a second sort of front in your work that you've opened up by addressing this question of the earliest origins of Islam. And you do so in a way that engages really in a robust way with the Quran itself, using the Quran as evidence and thinking through the problem of Islamic origins. I know some people don't like that term anymore, Islamic origins, but I'll use it, and people can add comments if they want to on the YouTube page here. But what led to this? Why did you begin the research that eventually culminated in Muhammad and the Believers?
Well, the book is, I realized after I'd finished it, it's kind of a distillation of everything I'd worked on in my career for the preceding 35 or 40 years, because it all kind of contributes in different ways. And it would be easy to sort of get the mistaken impression that somehow my career was very carefully planned. I moved from A to B to C to D, and then they were all summed up in this book. But it was a very haphazard process, and lurching from one thing to another. They had no connection, and I began to see the connections later on. And also, actually, the background of this book and the concept of Islamic origins, one of the books that I read, again, when I was an undergraduate, which I was very impressed by, was a book, I think his name was, the author's name was Van Meek, maybe Theophilus Van Meek. And he wrote a book called Hebrew Origins. It was about the early Hebrews and the history of the Hebrew Bible and so on. And I thought that was a really interesting book. And so as I got into early Islamic history, I sort of had this idea in the back, I should write a book on Islamic origins. It was a kind of a counterpart to that book. Well, I don't think my book has much to do in common with that book, probably, which I haven't looked at in 50 years. But nonetheless, that's, I had for a long time thought about working on this early period. I worked on the conquests, obviously, as a separate thing. And working on the conquest book, I was then immediately thrust into the problems with the literary sources. My book came out just after Hagerism appeared, Patricia Crona and Michael Cook's epic-making book, Hagerism.
Your book on the conquest.
Yes, it came out a few years after Hagerism. Hagerism was, I think, 77, and my book. And so I had just submitted my completed manuscript to the Princeton University Press, and Hagerism appears, which seemed to sort of invalidate everything I had said, because I was using the traditional sources in a way that they said we can't use them. So this lit a fire under me to start examining the historiography of these sources of Tabari and all these other chronicles which I had used. What I blithely thought would be a question of a couple of years or maybe a year or so and writing an article on it ended up taking me about 20 years before I got to Narratives of Islamic Origins. And that, the reason it took so long, as I explained actually in the preface to the book, the reason it took so long was, besides the fact that I'm lazy maybe, but was that I was starting off with an assumption that wasn't true, that everybody else was making. So I adopted this assumption. And I actually wrote a first chapter to what was going to be my book on historiography that was based on that assumption. But the fact was that even though rationally I didn't realize that this idea was wrong, I somehow emotionally sensed that it was wrong. And that created a block. I could not proceed with the work. My system wouldn't let me proceed with the work. The assumption was that there was some kind of sense of history in ancient Arabia and in the early Muslim community, that they already had a notion of history, that they wanted to do write a history. And so I put together a first chapter that talked about history in pre-Islamic Arabia. Did people write history? There was poetry, was it, so on. And then I looked at the Quran, and there's historical narratives or prophetic narratives about earlier prophets and so on in the Quran. So I sort of put that together. But I could never really somehow make that work as a basis for going on into the Islamic tradition. And it was because I realized ultimately that was wrong, that there was no real sense of history in the earliest Muslim community. It was motivated by concerns for piety and the coming last judgment, and piety was what mattered. They weren't legitimating themselves, as I say in my narratives book, they weren't legitimating themselves in terms of their history, they were legitimating themselves in terms of piety and their beliefs. When I finally realized that, then, well, I threw out that chapter I had started over, but I had a clear track to move ahead, because now this was something I could believe in, my juices were free to flow and produce a new formulation of things, which is what you get in the narratives book, which has a section on the Quran and its sort of ahistorical quality.
So in Muhammad and the Believers, just jumping ahead to that book, you have a very bold idea that we should think of the earliest community that followed the Prophet as believers and not yet as Muslims. You can clarify or correct if I'm not articulating this correctly. And then, and this is sort of the boldest element of the thesis, that it wasn't limited to the particular. Well, let me just put it in a positive sense. It could have included Jews and Christians as well. So, what are some of the arguments in favor of that? What would you say are the strongest arguments in favor of the idea that the early believing community was ecumenical in that sense?
Yeah, of course, ecumenical is the word I use too, but it's not really the right word because it implies that you have well-defined groups that agree to agree. They agree to disagree on things, but they're going to get along, right? And that's not what was going on here. But I didn't know any other word we could use. Jacques Tanous once suggested maybe we just say confusion, and there's something to be said for that, because the earliest people we call Muslims, I prefer to call them believers. I don't think they had hammered out the details of exactly what their belief system was. They had certain basic ideas, of course, that there's one God and so on, and that one must live righteously. But the fringes of it, the details of it, and how that made it relate to, say, Christianity and Judaism, I think these were things that it took them a couple of generations to sort out. The reason I prefer to use the word believers is because that's what the Quran talks about. Mm-hmm. As I say in my book, I mean, in the narratives book too, I think if you look at the use of terminology in the Quran is addressed to people who are called believers. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. I mean, this is the common, oh, you who believe. It does use the word Muslims about 70 times, but it uses believers, I don't know, 1,000 times. or other words like those who believe. It's overwhelmingly directed towards people who are conceived of as believers. And then the question is, okay, what does it mean to say someone's a believer? Mm-hmm. And I use the Quran for evidence for that. There are passages in the Quran where it says, a few passages where it says, among the Christians and the Jews and the Magians, there are some who believe, and they will have nothing to fear. Basically, they'll have nothing to fear in Judgment Day. They're going to go to heaven. God's going to take care of them, right? There are many others who don't believe, but there are some who do. So it looks like there are some of these people who, from these other communities, as we see them now, who were part of this believer community. So the line between believers and unbelievers is not the same as the line between Muslims and, say, Christians. Or it's not confessionally defined. It's defined on belief in one God, in the last judgment, and in righteous behavior. Now, what is the other evidence out beyond the Quran for this? Well, of course, here we are thrust into the situation of looking at 7th century Arabia and the Near East, where the number of documentary sources is extremely limited. We have, of course, there is this so-called, what's sometimes called the Constitution of Medina, the text of this apparent document, which is preserved in several different, I think there's 3 different versions, slightly different versions of it. In
Constitution being a sort of neologism, a modern imposition.
A modern term, yeah.
Yeah, it's not usually dustur.
It's the Sahifa, the Ummah document, or other possible terms for it. But I think Watt used the term Constitution of Medina, or Sargent, I know he did, and it became sort of the popular explanation for it. It's sort of like calling the Umayyad desert palaces, even though, although they're Umayyad, they aren't all in the desert and they aren't all palaces. we call them that because that's what everybody's come to call them. Anyway, so what can we use as evidence for the loosely defined quality of the early believers movement? I think the Constitution of Medina, as it is called, or the Sahifa document, with its passages that talk about the Jews being part of the Ummah, is important. What's really interesting, though, is that after that point, we have almost no evidence for the relationship of the Jews with the Ummah document. It's not that we have evidence that shows that they aren't part of the community, of the believers community in, say, the Umayyad period, or that they are. We just don't have any evidence about the Jews. They're not mentioned. And scholars of Judaism will, I think, confirm for you that there's we think we have bad sources for the early Islamic community. For the Jewish community this time, we have almost no evidence. So we're just kind of left in the dark about that. We can't really address it directly. But one thing we can see is that from documentary evidence too, is that in the course of the 7th century, there's a lot of participation of various Christians in the workings of the Umayyad government. So there seems to be some kind of cooperation there. And again, this may get us to the point of, back to this point of there being a kind of confusion. It may be that the Christians of the Near East who had diverse theological ideas, of course, there were several different confessions that fought each other like cats and dogs in the 6th century and 7th century. And when these new believers arrived from Arabia who were preaching monotheism and so on, and they honored Jesus as a prophet and so on, they thought, oh, well, we can work with these people. And, it was only after a couple of generations they began to realize, well, they honor Jesus as a prophet, but they don't recognize the divinity of Jesus, which for Christians is a what do you want to say, a deal breaker.
A biggie, yeah.
And similarly, I think the believers coming from Arabia saw these Christians, there are some positive verses in the Quran about Christians. Oh, you who believe, those who are closest to you are those who call themselves Christians because they have monks and priests and they're not proud or something like that. So there may have been a kind of initial idea of sympathizing with Christians and Christian communities. And we know from some document, well, it's literary, but quasi-documentary evidence, like the letters of the patriarch of the Church of the East, Isoyav III in Tespon. He wrote sometime like in the 640s, he wrote to one of his bishops or something, and he said, well, you know, these new rulers, these Tayyaye, whatever he calls them, they honor our monks and our priests, and they treat us well, and so, you know, that's not a negative description of the way the believers from Arabia were treating the Christians of.
Can I just get in just to explain that one term? You mentioned the word Tayyaye. So just if people aren't familiar with that term, so that's the typical way in which the Syriac Christian authors of the earlier period referred to Muslims/Arabs. There's a little bit of complications there, probably based on one of the names, the Arabic names of a tribe. But yeah, so more often they're called Mahagrai or Tayyaye, and not a word that sort of is equivalent to Muslims. So
yeah, the Syriac terminology for the earliest believers, as I like to call them, what most people would call them Muslims, is itself a very interesting problem. You mentioned Mahagraye, which seems to be somehow related to the word Muhajirin, immigrants coming out of Arabia.
Right.
Tayyaye, of course, is a standard word, but there's also this word in Syriac, Arab, but they never use it to refer to these people coming from Arabia, because for them, the Arab were the semi-nomads that were part of their world in Mesopotamia and Syria. They had constructive relations with these people, whereas the Tayyaye were the sort of much feared camel nomads who came from farther south from Arabia, and they came and they sort of wrecked everything. They disrupted the sort of peaceable relations between settled communities and the local semi-nomads that had been working in a rhythmic fashion for centuries. Yes. The Tayyaye came in and took hostages and extorted money, and so they're a less welcome presence in the Syriac sources, and so that's the term that's usually used.
Right. And now I want to circle back because we've gone forward into questions of the early non-Muslim sources and how they could lend evidence to the believers' argument. But I want to circle back just to the Quran itself, especially because, that's what we do above all in this channel. You alluded to a passage in the Quran that speaks of believers or the upright among the Jews and the Christians. So I just want to read a passage from your book. So this is on page 70. And you write in the text, believers then, whatever religious confession they may have belonged to, whether, and then in parentheses you have non-Trinitarian, Christians, end parentheses, Christians, Jews, or what we might call Qur'anic monotheists, recent converts from paganism, were expected to live strictly by the law that God had revealed to their communities. And then in a text box, you have a passage from Quran Al-Imran, verses 113 to 116, which I think might be the one you were alluding to earlier in our chat, in which the Quran declares, among the people of the book are an upright company. They recite God's verses through the night while prostrating themselves. They believe, there's the key word, they believe in God and the last day, and enjoin kindness and forbid abominations and hasten to do good things, etc., etc. So I just wanted to highlight that verse. So an explicit identification of believers among the people of the book. Maybe you can comment on this, maybe an allusion to nightly vigils that monks would have. And I want to throw in another verse there too and see if you want to comment on either one, which is, I think it's Hujurat, it's Quran 49, and in which we have this declaration. I mean, the Quran says, I'll just read it in Arabic and then we could speak with the English translation. قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. So the Arab, now my one translation is the nomadic Arabs, say, we have believed, amanna, say you have not believed, but say we have submitted, aslamna, so that being the verbal form of the active participle that gives us the word Muslim. So, I mean, there's a clear, at least in this verse, there's a clear differentiation between what it means to believe and what it means to submit or to be Muslim. So I don't know if you want to comment on either of those.
Yeah, I think that's an important passage because there's a lot of, I think, later exegetical work, even relative to today, where people will say, well, the Quran talks about mu'minun, believers. It means Muslims. Same thing. Well, this passage means they're related in some way, these two terms, but they don't mean the same thing. There's some kind of distinction there, obviously, being drawn. It says, don't say you're believers, say you are Muslims. You have submitted, and the sort of usual understanding of that is it means you've submitted to God's will, so you're dedicated, devoted to God in some way. But one wonders, in this case, talking about nomadic groups, whether maybe they didn't submit to the authority of Muhammad's new little state or something. We don't know. It doesn't explain it any further. We don't have any other evidence to go on. But it's an important passage because it does show that there is some kind of distinction being made even in the Quran between mu'min and Muslim as what they mean.
Excuse me. Yeah. And
we can fight about that for a long time.
Yeah. One of the counter arguments might be those passages which seem to identify religion with Islam. I think it's in Al-Imran, but I might be getting this wrong, where the Quran says, Inna deen andallah al-Islam.
Pardon me, by religion, you mean deen.
Yeah. Okay. So you can.
Another problematic word.
Good. Yeah. So that might be the solution or the answer. But yeah, there's the passage which says religion with God, Inna deen andallah al-Islam. And then most famously in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 3, we have the passage in which is, today I have perfected my atmamtu alaykum na'mati wa akmaltu lakum dinakum. Let me get the exact passage, but basically, traditionally rendered as, I have designated your religion for you as Islam. So I don't know if you want to, why these seem to be, at least as they're typically understood, explicit identifications of your religion as Islam. Let me just get it. I want to do justice to the verse because my memory didn't really serve me there. So here we have the famous passage in Quran chapter 5 verse 3, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورديت لكم الإسلام دينا. So, and I have raditu, I have approved or been satisfied for you with Islam as your deen. So, what about these passages that make that association?
Well, I wrestled with these in an article I wrote for a volume about my teacher. Actually, one of my teachers was Günter Lühling. I think I'm his only student, really, only pupil. Lühling had all kinds of radical ideas about the Quran. Anyway, I was asked to contribute an article to that volume, and I wrote an article called, I got to get the order right, something like Islam, Muslim und Deen im Quran. It's in German. I wrote it in German. And so in that article, I wrestled with this question. And what's interesting, the word deen, first of all, has a multiple etymology in the Quran. On the one hand, one dimension of its meaning, or when it's used, sometimes it seems to come from the Aramaic dina, meaning law or judgment. So when we say Yawm ad-Din, we're not talking about the day of religion, we're talking about the day of judgment. And there's a very nice illustration of that also, of its meaning as law in the Surah Yusuf, where there's this point where Joseph takes a cup or something and hides it in the saddlebags of one of his brothers, and then so he plants it, and then when the brothers are being checked by the customs officers as they're trying to leave the country, they find this thing and they arrest them and they say, you've broken the Deen al-Melek, you've broken the law of the king. It obviously doesn't mean religion, it means law. Then there's a general assumption on the part of philologists who know these things much better than I do, that another meaning of deen comes probably from Arabic or somehow from Semitic, and it just means like customary behavior. So you see that. And then there is the borrowing from Middle Persian dain, which means like good religion. and that seems to be the verses where it's used in the sense of religion. It seems to be coming from this Middle Persian etymology, which also had found its way into Arabic. So it seems like Arabic at the time of the Prophet, the 7th century, late 6th century, must have had all of these different possible meanings for the word deen in circulation. What's interesting is that in the Quran, the overwhelming majority of the occurrences of the word have to do with either the first or the second meaning and not with the meaning of religion. That's sort of definitely the minority one. And it gets, like everything else, when you start getting into it, it gets complicated. But it seems to me that, you know, for example, the passage that says there are problems with there are only I think 7 places in the Quran where the word Islam is used. There are more where Muslim is used, but altogether there's only like 7 in the Quran, something like that use the word Islam. And in most cases, it seems to be simply the verbal noun form of the idea of submitting yourself to God's will. It doesn't seem to be the name for, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith would have said, a reified religion, which is what it becomes. Obviously, when we talk about Islam, we're talking about Islam as a reified religion, and that's the word we use for it. But in the Quran, it doesn't seem to use it in that way, except maybe 2 or 3 times. And each one of those 3 times is somehow, to me, suspicious. There's a problem with them when you look at them. One, for example, this famous verse, how did it go? Ad-Din and Allah al-Islam, right? There is a variant reading of that says Ad-Din and Allah al-Hanifiyya, which is like,
I think it's attributed to the Mus'haf of Ibn Mas'ud. Yes.
Yeah, and the Hanifiyya is, of course, the term that is used in the Quran and in the Muslim tradition for the supposed sort of autochthonous monotheism that was around in Arabia. So if did the text originally say Ad-Din and Allah al-Hanifiyya, and then at some point it was changed to Ad-Din and Allah al-Islam? You know, it shows up in the Dome of the Rock inscriptions as Ad-Din and Allah al-Islam. So I wonder whether Abdul Malik and his advisors weren't the ones who came up with that version of the text, and that's why it's in the Quran. Well, who knows? The other 2 passages where Islam is used as apparently as a reified religious term, also, it seems to me, can be, they don't seem to really carry that water effectively. So I'm not sure that Islam, you know, that we can say that Islam in the reified sense was something that is visible in the Quran. We can see that the components of which the reified religion of Islam is made are found in the Quran, but the designation of it doesn't seem to me to be there.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so the verse we're speaking about there is Al-Imran, Surah 3, verse 19. And it's interesting, yeah, because it does go on to speak about the divisions among the people of the book, or those who were given the book. But it's on Quranic evidence alone, I mean, I think your take is very convincing. Munim Suri, for in a different context, has made similar arguments in his book, Scriptural Polemics, that when you look at the Quran's use of the term deen, it's not always sectarian. It can be more about a religious disposition or something like that. There's something else that's really, really strong and bold in Muhammad and the Believers, which is your argument that religious zeal or faith generally is key to understanding the origin of Islam. I'm sure this is a thread that you draw through other books and articles as well. So we could just speak about it generally, perhaps. But I like to think of this. I know there may be other sort of conversation partners, not to say opponents, that you might have in mind by advancing this argument. But I like to think of this as a real shift in thought on Islamic origins, because at least according to my maybe naive understanding, that in mid to late-ish 20th century scholarship, people like Maxime Rodinson and Montgomery Watt really pushed the social reform narrative for the origins of Islam. So, I mean, the narrative is sort of built on the conviction that the Quraysh really were traders. They were, Mecca was a merchant city, and the city was sort of overflowing with wealth. This had all sorts of impacts socially because the merchant class neglected in their sort of greed, they neglected the poor and the orphans and the widows. But it also meant a sort of decline in the religious values or mores of the Meccans generally. And so this is sort of what inspired the Prophet. Like his conscience was awakened by seeing the social decline of Mecca. I don't know. Is that how you think of advancing this argument? Is it somehow a response to that social reform narrative, or something else going on?
Yeah, I think it is a response to it. I mean, I think that in the middle of the 20th century, after the Second World War, let's say, I think there was a tendency for at that time, the dominant, I would say, or what do you want to say, the sexiest of the disciplines were the social sciences. There was this sense that, sociology, political science, economics, they were going to answer all our questions. We could understand society, human societies.
Where things actually get done.
Yeah. And I think that what happened was that people like Watt in particular were very caught up in that. It was the latest, the way you did scholarship, and it's compellingly, it's a persuasive set of arguments often. And I think they were caught up with this. And so historians, I think, in the middle of the 20th century became very uncomfortable with the idea of religion, with the idea of religious explanation. They were themselves either completely secularist in their attitude, they didn't belong to themselves, they didn't believe in any revealed religious tradition. They weren't Muslims, Christians, or Jews particularly.
Although Watt would be an exception to this rule, right?
Was a clergyman. Mm-hmm. But this is why I love this. I've forgotten which French scholar it was who wrote a review of Watt's Muhammad at Mecca. We know, which has a very secular explanation, with social melees in Mecca, and this causes the rise of Muhammad's career and the rise of Islam. And this guy wrote a review of Watt's book saying, he titled his review, A Marxist Interpretation of Islam by an Episcopal Clergyman. It's a wonderful title for his review. And anyway, the reviewer also saw this tendency on the part of Watt, and was shared by almost everybody else at the time, to try and find what you might say real explanations for religious phenomena. So there had to be a sociological, an economic, a political science
even kind of ecological for some, right?
Beg pardon?
Even ecological, some would argue that there was. Yeah.
Well, that goes back long before that. What I call the ecological thesis for the expansion of Islam and the conquest goes back to the 19th century. That's a very old tradition. And anyway, I think in the middle of the 20th century, a lot of scholars were caught up in this sort of reverence for the social sciences and their explanatory power. And Watt was using that, harnessing that to try and explain the rise of Islam, which is not an unreasonable thing to have done. But my sense was that historians didn't give proper credit to religion, not in the sense that they should have believed in the religions, but they should realize that religious beliefs can be a powerful force in history. You may not believe any of those religious beliefs, but as a historian, you still have to recognize that they're a powerful force shaping history. And they somehow had tended not to do that. They wanted to show that the conquest or the rise of Islam was all because of economic and social factors. No, I think there were also religious motivations on the part of many of these people. In particular, I like the idea that they were motivated partly by fears of the coming last judgment, what we usually call apocalypticism of some kind. That's not social or economic. That's a kind of religious ideology that motivates people to do sometimes extraordinary things. And I think that may have been part of what was going on with the rise of Islam. On the other hand, so yes, I think my work does stand as a kind of reaction against this shall we say, purely secular or social scientific explanation of things. On the other hand, as I have told generations of students, any movement, any social movement that finds broad success, and certainly we can see Islam as a movement that found broad success socially. It's converted billions of people over the century. But even at the beginning, it had great success. And I think any movement that succeeds to that degree has to have sort of different levels. It has to operate on different levels. So you have to have a powerful ideological motivation or idea that's kind of the focus of it. But you also have to have social and economic factors that help bring people on board. So there are some people who are completely wrapped up with the idea of the oneness of God and the need to be pious and so on. Well, those are the ones to whom the basic ideas appeal. But then there are other people who don't care about that at all, but they really want more money, or they want plunder, or, you know, they are, so the movement had things that appeal to them as well, emoluments for them. So I think any movement that's going to succeed in any political situation, right up until today, it has to have a range of sources of appeal. So, you know, it's not like the socioeconomic explanations are completely irrelevant. They are relevant in a way, but one has to always ask, what is the central thing? What makes it all happen? For me, I think it's this set of new ideas, religious ideas that come on board.
Okay, so now you mentioned apocalypticism here towards the end of your last remarks, and I think that's one of the keys to explaining the possibility that this was again, you've qualified this word, but an ecumenical movement, the believers movement. There's been some criticism of this idea as something that reflects the 21st century more than the 7th. Today, everyone loves, I mean, at least those who care about religion at all, like the idea of, you know, ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, and can't we all get along? And anyway, all religions basically teach the same thing. But the 7th century mindset was religions don't teach the same thing. My religion is the true one, yours is the false one. I'm here to either convince you of it or to subject you to our authority, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, how would you respond to that? I think we've addressed it a little bit, but I don't know if you want to circle back to that criticism and add anything else.
Yeah, sure. That's one of the things that Patricia Crona said in an online review of my work, that I was sort of offering the nice, tolerant view of Islam that modern liberals want, you know. Well, that certainly wasn't my intention when I wrote the book, and I don't think that's what the book does or what my work generally does, because I think I'm quite clear in the book on a bunch of things. I talk about the ecumenicism, as I call it there, because I didn't have another word, but it's really the fact that this movement is not restricted by confession. So people from other confessions, as we might call them, from different Christian or Jewish or whatever groups, if they have the right beliefs, if they believe in one God, the last day, and they live righteously, they can be part of the believers movement. You know, they might still be a Jew or a Christian, but they're a part of the believers movement. Okay, so that's maybe not ecumenicism, but it's some kind of blurring of the borders of things. But there's another section in that same chapter, actually, where I talk about ecumenicism, where I talk about the intensity of their beliefs and the sort of uncompromising pietism. I don't think of these people as sort of easygoing kumbaya types, you know. I think of them as very hard-nosed and narrow-minded, probably. You know, if you didn't believe the basic things that they thought you should believe, that there's one God, the last day, and you need to live righteously, you were simply not in the fold. You were not a believer, and you were, you know, not part of their group at all. So I don't think it was this sort of easygoing toleration. It was more clear-sighted than that. It's just that the clear-sightedness did not draw lines around different religious confessions. It looked at what people actually believed and how they acted, rather than what the tag was that they belonged to. And it's also important to remember that even though, for example, in the 6th century and into the 7th, there were Christian communities in the Near East that fought each other bitterly in polemics and considered the Monophysites considered the Chalcedonians heretics and vice versa, and they all considered the Church of the East to be heretics and vice versa. They had nothing good to say about each other. And yet, as Jack Danus has shown, these people cross the lines all the time. The priest in this village, Monophysite village, is away for a month. Somebody dies in the village. They go to the next village. He's Chalcedonian. They bring their priest to give the last rites on their guy to be buried because he needed to be buried. And well, at least he's a Christian. He's the wrong kind. People marry somebody from the other community and join it for 25 years, and then they move back to their original community. We have all this, as Tanus has shown very nicely in his book, drawing on, I guess, Jacob of Edessa's epistles or responsa from his priests and bishops writing to him. There are all kinds of cases of people crossing these boundaries, including the boundaries with the Muhaggaraye, as they're called in his sources, what we would call the believers of the Muslims. A wonderful one that he brings up, you can also find it in Hoyland's collection of translated sources from Jacob of Edessa, of a priest writes to Jacob of Edessa, the bishop, saying, one of the members of my congregation is a woman, and she's married a Muhaggab, a Muslim, as we would say, but she's a Christian. And I told her that, because she's married this Muhaggar, I'm not going to give her the Eucharist. She can't take communion. But now the Muhaggar is threatening to kill me if I don't give her the Eucharist. So what kind of boundaries are these? It's a very interesting insight into the sort of fluidity of things at this time. As I say, perhaps Tanus's description of this as a kind of period of confusion is maybe the best one. People are working out in their own minds and for their own communities exactly what the borders are. And then once they get the borders exactly established, then people cross them anyway, as we all do when we have borders in our lives, whether they're national, religious, or whatever.
Exactly. So there's another element to the argument that I wanted to touch on before we conclude. And I think it's actually related to part of the arguments of Jack Tanus. By the way, shameless plug for another episode that viewers will find on Exploring the Quran and the Bible with Jack Tanus. Was one of the first interviews I did. So look that up and hear more about his arguments in regard to the simple believers of the early Islamic Middle East and late antique Middle East. But this notion of simple believers actually seems, although I think, he uses this term after you published Muhammad and the Believers, but it seems to be a nice way of encapsulating the specific argument you have about how Muslims, let's just, maybe this is a little too romantic or fantastical, but let's say, soldiers out in the Islamic conquest on the front lines, fighting together with a Christian who was part of the Believers movement. And, you sort of anticipate the objection. Well, wait a second. Yeah, the Quran does say nice things about Christians. You alluded before to Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 82, where it says those closest in love to the believers are Christians. But it also says, pretty polemical things about their beliefs. In Surah At-Tawbah, for example, it's in verses 29 and 30. Verse 29 says, basically, fight them until they are submissive or they give the jizya in submission. But then you say, listen, if we're imagining our soldiers out on the front lines in, say, I don't know, 650s, something like that, would everyone have known everything that's in the Quran? Was everyone literate? But did people actually know about the Quran? So could you elaborate on that? And have you thought more about that argument? Do you still find it compelling?
Well, one can think about it, but the problem is we don't have any evidence to actually prove it one way or the other. But, one thing we can be sure of, though, is that, we know that nobody in the 7th century could simply go online and check a verse of the Quran, or for that matter, probably go into their library and pull off a copy. There weren't any. It was something that people knew bits and pieces of from recitation, perhaps, and maybe they only knew a few verses. They knew
enough for prayer, maybe, or
yes, and that's also a puzzling thing. The Quran, Islamic law, sort of mandates that when you're performing the salat, you should recite verses of the Quran, but it never tells you which one. None, well, except for the Fatiha. There's no liturgy in the, say, Christian sense of a liturgy, where for every Sunday, every occasion, there's a specific passage of scripture that's required. That's certainly not the case in Quran. It says you should recite something, but any verse that you want. It has to be at least one long verse or 3 short verses, something like that, if you read it, in the Hanafi text. But there's nothing stipulated for what, you would think that they might have developed a liturgy like, well, this is the prophet's birthday, we're going to read these verses. This is the date of the Hijrah, we're going to read these, this is the Battle of Uhud, this is the battle, we don't know. That none of that exists as a liturgy coming from the Quran text. That's kind of a detour, I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah, okay, great. So, I found that a very compelling part of the argument, and something that's often just completely forgotten, because scholars in the field of Quranic studies, they debate the origins of the Quran, its collection, and then canonization acceptance, but they don't really ask the question of its dissemination or diffusion among the believers. And I think if you think of the contemporary example, just and we live in the internet age, but whether it's Islam or Christianity, if you go out on the streets, people's knowledge is different depending on who you ask. They may know more or less of the Quran. And if we think back to the mid 7th century, we would be in an even more fluid situation. I wanted to ask one last question, and then we'll wrap up. But it's a good one. Maybe I shouldn't have saved it to the end. Hopefully, lots of people are still watching by this point. So we mentioned Jack Tanous, who I was able to interview, and you've mentioned briefly Patricia Crona as, she reviewed Muhammad and the Believers and had some critical things to say. I'm convinced that she was the anonymous outside reader when I submitted my dissertation for publication, in part because of the sharpness of the pen. That was, then it was really marginal notes, right? It was literally real marginal notes, and there was many critical comments, but almost inevitably they were right on point.
Right.
Whoever that external reviewer is. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm flattering myself to think that she actually read the dissertation. But in my mind, like, I sometimes think of Fred Donner, Patricia Crona on this question of Muhammad and the Believers as like a classic showdown. Maybe the story goes back further than that. I don't know how much you want to say. Obviously, just whatever you feel comfortable. There's a really great, and maybe my romantic notion is, in fact, in part inspired by the documentary that Tom Holland did that I think appeared on BBC4. I don't know if it's available online. It's super interesting watch, because not only does it have the traditional documentary stuff where Tom Holland is in the Middle East investigating the actual sites, but it has interviews with scholars like Fred Donner and Patricia Crone, Sayed Hossein Nasser, and others. I think Guy Strooms is in there. Could I just ask you to say a word or two about Patricia and your back and forth with her through the years?
Well, we started off in a kind of awkward way because I was asked to review her second book. The first book of hers by herself, that was Slaves on Horses. And the Slaves on Horses had been, the guts of it, the central part of it, is kind of a big database about clientage in the Umayyad period, Mawali clients in the Umayyad period and their role. And that was done at SOAS under the direction of Bernard Lewis, and it's a very sober and careful piece of work. It's fine. But she packages it for publication by Cambridge University Press with an introductory chapter and a concluding chapter, which sandwiches it in a grandiose hypothesis about nomadic powers and so on. And I didn't really care for the beginnings of the book at all. So I wrote a review, I think, for JAOS, Journal of the American Oriental Society, in which I took her to task And, if you're going to write a review that's negative, especially if you don't have tenure yet, I think or maybe already had it, I hadn't come to Chicago yet, I was writing it at Yale. If you're going to write a critical review of something, if you're going to write a positive review, you can do that in 200 words or 500 words. That's great. If you're going to write a critical review, you've got to provide detailed evidence, and it's going to be longer. So this review was, I don't know, 6-7 pages long. And I basically criticized her procedure for like four basic points, one of which was a kind of making metaphors on metaphors on metaphors. She was saying, well, the Arab migration is something like the Mongol migration into the Near East. And in that case, then Syria is something like Iran. And it kept getting farther and farther afield with these comparisons. And she was talking about American Indians and talking about Vietnam. And I was like, where is this going? This is not, for me, it was not acceptable historical method. So I criticized her on that and on some other things. The way she tended to phrase things sometimes struck me as more cute than illuminating, in a desire to be cutting. And this was not a review that she was obviously happy to read. I sent her a copy of my forthcoming review before it appeared and told her, well, I'm sorry. I found some problems here. I know you won't be happy to read this, but I figured you might as well get it from the horse's mouth. So then shortly after that, she reviewed my book, also with in a rather harsh way. So we sort of started off on a bad way. But we met each other a few years later through the efforts of Larry Conrad, who was part of organizing a conference that Patricia was organizing a series of conferences on Hadith. And I was invited to one of those. I finally met her, and we obviously represented different perspectives on things, but we got along, and over the years we really kind of made peace with each other. She certainly was one of the most amazing scholars that the field of Islamic studies has ever seen. I think she, as with your dissertation, she didn't take any prisoners. She was very blunt. She would say what she believed, and she was usually, not always, but usually she had very good reasons for what she said. So it paid to listen to what she had to say. She was some people thought she was a Muslim hater, but she worked well with many Muslims as colleagues and so on. She was motivated, I think, simply by a clear sense of what it is to be a historian. And her book, Hagerism, with Michael Cook, what the book is basically saying is, okay, all you people who say you're doing early Islamic history, what you're doing is simply replicating what the Muslim tradition says. You can't do that. You've got to act like historians. Wake up and be historians. That's sort of the challenge. The gauntlet she was throwing down, and she was correct to do that. They were correct to do it. Because it's true. Western histories, as she puts it in one of her other books, maybe it's in Slaves and Horse, somewhere else, she says Western chronicles, Western histories of Islam, of early Islam, are basically Muslim chronicles translated into Western language and graced with Western titles. She's right. So she really had a very clear vision of the problems of our field. We all owe her a huge debt of gratitude for that. And she was a remarkable scholar. She worked not just on early Islam, but she worked on later questions, and she researched them deeply and wrote very wisely about them. One of my favorite articles of hers actually has nothing to do with Islam. It's about tribalism. She has an article on tribes and their relationships to states, which is it's very original and it's fascinating, and she may be right. It's really interesting interpretation. It has nothing to do with Islam.
Right.
She was a first-rate intellect, and her as a relatively early demise. She died 5 years ago or something, 7 maybe now. It was too early.
Too early indeed. Well, speaking of remarkable scholars, thank you for being with me for this conversation. I hope it's only the first go and that we'll have another go at it at another point. Before we close, though, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to mention maybe briefly what you're working on now, and also if people want to stay in touch with your work, is there an easy way to do that? How do they follow what you're working on?
What am I working on now? Editing a lot of conference papers from conferences I've organized, so that's less interesting. What I've been working on lately really is Arabic papyri, because my sense from my work on historiography that the chronicle sources, the literary sources, they're very important, but they're also very problematic. And one way to help contain the problems is to rely as much as possible on documentary evidence. And one problem in our field is that because we had these nice prepackaged narratives about what happened, we didn't have to go to the documentary sources to find out. So we tended to neglect them. So now, fortunately, there's a new wave of people working, especially with Arabic papyri, and also a lot of people working on numismatics, inscriptions, and so on. So these are good developments, but I want to try and contribute to that a little bit by working with some Arabic papyri for the early period. What was the other?
If you want, if there's a good way to stay in touch with your work, if people want to follow you, is it?
I guess I have some things up on academia.edu.
Okay.
So that's where you find it.
That would be the place. Okay. Well, Professor Donner, thank you so much for being on Exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Thank you very much. My honor to be here.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.